It began not with a business plan or a strategy deck, but with a simple question. Why? That word, seemingly so small, had the power to change the course of companies, movements, and lives. While many were preoccupied with what they did and how they did it, very few paused to ask why they did it. But those who did, those who grounded their actions in a purpose greater than profit or fame, they were the ones who truly stood apart. They inspired not just transactions, but loyalty. They led not just teams, but revolutions. Simon Sinek had spent years studying the patterns of leadership and influence. He noticed that the greatest leaders, the ones who captured the hearts and minds of people, weren't necessarily the ones with the best products, the biggest budgets, or the sharpest skills. They were the ones who communicated from the inside out. They started with why. Apple didn't begin with a mission to build sleek electronics. It began with a belief, to challenge the status quo, to think differently. Everything they did, design, engineering, marketing, was simply a reflection of that belief. As a result, people didn't just buy computers from Apple. They bought into Apple, and the loyalty they showed was unlike anything seen in typical consumer behavior. The pattern repeated in every field. Martin Luther King Jr. didn't say, "I have a plan." He said, "I have a dream." He didn't present a 15-point strategy for civil rights reform. He painted a vision rooted in a deep belief about equality and justice, and people followed, not just because of the cause, but because of the clarity with which he articulated why that cause mattered. The Wright brothers, two bicycle makers from Dayton, Ohio, defied all odds when they became the first to achieve powered flight. They had no money, no formal education in aviation, and no government grants. Meanwhile, Samuel Pierpont Langley had everything: funding from the War Department, access to brilliant minds, and press coverage. But while Langley was chasing fame and fortune, the Wright brothers were driven by something deeper. They believed in the power of flight to transform the world. That belief fueled their perseverance. And on a cold December morning in 1903, they succeeded where others failed, not because of what they did, but because of why they did it. Simon began to understand that all inspiring leaders and organizations operate in the same fundamental way. They all start with why. He visualized it as a golden circle. At the center, why. The next ring, how. The outer ring, what. Every organization on the planet knows what they do. Some know how they do it, their unique value propositions or processes. But very few know why they do it, and yet it's that clarity of why that makes all the difference. When an organization communicates from the outside in, starting with what, then how, then maybe why, it's harder to inspire. But when they start from the inside out, beginning with why, they speak to the part of the brain that drives behavior. People don't buy what you do, they buy why you do it. And what you do simply proves what you believe. It's a biological truth. The neocortex, the outer layer of the brain, is responsible for rational and analytical thought. It understands language. But the limbic brain, deeper within, is responsible for feelings like trust and loyalty. It's also where decision-making happens. The limbic brain has no capacity for language. That's why it's hard to put feelings into words. It's why people say, "It just felt right." And when organizations or leaders communicate starting with why, they speak directly to that limbic brain. Simon remembered a time when he met a business owner named Laura. She ran a small clothing brand. Her designs were good, her marketing was fine, and her prices were fair. But sales were flat. She tried discounts, influencers, new collections. Nothing moved the needle. Simon asked her why she started the company. She paused. Then she said, "I wanted women to feel strong, confident, and seen." That was her why. It had been buried under spreadsheets and campaigns. Together, they reworked her messaging, product stories, and customer experience to reflect that belief. Within months, her business transformed. Not because of a change in what she sold, but because of a change in how she communicated why she sold it. The power of why extended far beyond branding or marketing. It reached into the core of leadership. Great leaders don't just have visions, they embody them. They don't just tell people what to do, they show them why it matters. That clarity attracts people who believe what they believe. And when people believe in the same cause, they will give their blood, sweat, and tears to advance it. In organizations where the why is clear, employees feel a sense of belonging. They're not just doing a job, they're contributing to a mission. In such cultures, trust runs deep, innovation flourishes, and resilience is strong. But when the why is fuzzy or forgotten, cynicism creeps in. People become disengaged, work becomes transactional, and performance suffers. Simon had seen this firsthand in countless companies. He recalled one Fortune 500 firm that brought him in to address declining morale. On paper, everything looked fine: profits, market share, operations. But inside, something was missing. Employees felt disconnected. They showed up, did their tasks, and went home. There was no spark, no belief. Simon spent days talking to people at every level. What emerged was a story of lost purpose. The company had grown so fast and scaled so wide that its original why had been diluted. Together, they worked to rediscover that purpose. They asked hard questions. What had inspired the founders? What values had shaped the early days? Slowly, a clear why emerged: to empower creativity in every person they touched. When that belief returned to the center of decision-making, things began to shift. Engagement rose, innovation picked up. People didn't just return to work, they reconnected to why they worked. Start with why wasn't a theory, it was a pattern, a blueprint. It showed up again and again, in every sector and every era. And yet, it was so often overlooked, perhaps because it seemed too simple or too abstract. But those who embraced it knew its power. There was the story of Southwest Airlines. While other carriers focused on luxury, routes, or prices, Southwest had a different belief: to democratize the skies. They believed that flying should be accessible to everyone. That belief guided every decision, from their no-frills service to their quirky culture. And it paid off. Not only did they become consistently profitable, but they also built an army of loyal customers and employees. Then there was Costco. Their what was bulk retail. Their how was membership and limited selection. But their why was treating people with dignity, employees and customers alike. They paid their workers well, offered benefits, and fostered trust. The result? Low turnover, high satisfaction, and long-term success. Even in politics, the same pattern held. Great movements didn't start with policies or plans. They started with a dream, a belief, a cause. People didn't march in Washington because of tax rates. They marched because they believed in something bigger than themselves. Simon often pointed out that starting with why was not about being better. It was about being different. Better is temporary. Someone can always come along with a better price, better features, or better quality. But different is sustainable, especially when it's grounded in a deep belief. The challenge, of course, was maintaining clarity of why over time. As organizations grew, as pressures mounted, as market forces shifted, it became easy to drift, to focus on the what, to chase the how. But those who lasted, those who endured, were the ones who protected their why like a flame. Simon thought of Starbucks. When it started, it wasn't just about coffee. It was about creating a third place, a community space between home and work. That belief drove their early growth. But as they scaled rapidly, some of that purpose got lost. Stores became impersonal. The experience suffered. Eventually, Howard Schultz returned and reminded everyone why Starbucks existed. He closed hundreds of stores for retraining. He recentered the company around its why, and slowly, trust returned. The lesson was clear. Whether you were a solo entrepreneur, a CEO, a teacher, or a parent, if you could articulate your why, if you could live it and share it, you could inspire, you could lead, you could build something that mattered. Simon knew that starting with why was just the beginning. The real work was in staying true to it, day after day, decision after decision. It wasn't always easy, but it was always worth it. Because in a noisy world, purpose was magnetic. In a cynical world, belief was powerful. And in a disconnected world, those who started with why could build lasting bonds. He had seen it change businesses, schools, nonprofits, and even relationships. People want to belong. They want to be part of something meaningful. And when you start with why, you invite them into that meaning. So he continued to teach, to write, to speak. Not to become famous or to sell books, but because he believed that everyone should wake up feeling inspired, go to work feeling safe, and return home feeling fulfilled. That was his why. And everything he did flowed from that belief. In a world filled with competition, noise, and distraction, the clarity of why stands out like a lighthouse on a foggy coast. For Simon, the more he studied organizations and leaders, the more evident the pattern became. When people followed a why, they stayed longer, committed deeper, and gave more of themselves. It wasn't just about motivation, it was about meaning. People would do irrational things in the name of belief. They'd drive miles past other coffee shops for the one they believed in. They'd camp overnight to be first in line, not for a product, but for what that product represented. That wasn't loyalty to a brand, it was loyalty to a cause. Simon often told the story of a company that sold outdoor gear. On the surface, they offered backpacks, jackets, and boots. But when he walked into their store, what he saw was different. Every poster, every staff interaction, every product tag whispered the same message: protect nature. Their why was conservation. Their how was sustainable materials and ethical sourcing. Their what was gear. Customers didn't just shop there, they joined a movement. The gear became a symbol, not the reason. Contrast that with the average corporation. Charts, spreadsheets, campaigns, meetings, layers of bureaucracy, but often no heartbeat. People clocked in and clocked out. They performed their duties. They collected their pay. But passion, purpose, those were rare. And that absence was costly. Not just in productivity, but in innovation, in morale, in retention. Simon had once been invited to a major tech company to help with a cultural reset. The company was struggling with turnover, internal politics, and waning market relevance. As he sat with their executives, he asked a simple question: why does your company exist? The room fell silent. They spoke of metrics, product pipelines, and global expansion, but there was no clarity of belief, no story, no cause. They had lost their why in the pursuit of scale, and it showed. Together, they began the work of rediscovery. They went back to the beginning, to the founder's intentions, to the early days of scrappy purpose. Slowly, they uncovered a core belief that technology should empower creativity in everyone, not just experts. That idea became their North Star. Decisions were tested against it. Teams were aligned to it. And over time, the company began to revive, not because of a new product, but because of a renewed sense of why. It wasn't just organizations that needed a why. Individuals did too. Simon often met professionals who were successful on paper, promotions, salaries, titles, but who felt empty. They'd climbed ladders only to realize the view at the top wasn't what they expected. In coaching sessions, he would ask, "What do you believe in? What makes you feel alive?" Often the answers took time, but when they came, they unlocked energy, clarity, and direction. There was a lawyer who rediscovered her love for advocacy. A teacher who remembered that education was about empowerment, not testing. A manager who realized his real passion was mentoring, not spreadsheets. Their paths didn't always change dramatically, but their perspectives did. And with that shift, their work took on new meaning. Simon believed that starting with why required vulnerability. It meant admitting that not everything was about money or efficiency. It meant acknowledging that people are driven by feelings, by purpose, by stories. That leadership wasn't about control, but about service. And that the best organizations weren't machines. They were organisms, built on trust and shared values. He remembered speaking at a leadership conference. The room was filled with CEOs, entrepreneurs, and changemakers. Instead of starting with statistics or trends, he told a story of a small bakery that had survived a recession not by cutting costs, but by doubling down on their why. They believed that community matters, so they kept staff, hosted events, and gave away bread to families in need. Customers noticed. Word spread. And when the economy recovered, they didn't just bounce back, they grew. That story landed more deeply than any chart ever could, because it spoke to the human side of business. It reminded the audience that behind every transaction was a person, and people don't rally for profits, they rally for purpose. One of Simon's favorite examples of a purpose-driven brand was Harley-Davidson. On paper, they sold motorcycles, but in reality, they sold freedom, rebellion, and identity. That's why customers tattooed the logo on their bodies. It wasn't about the specs, it was about the symbolism. The why was emotional, and it bonded riders into a tribe. The same was true for Tom's shoes. The product was simple, canvas footwear, but their why was giving. For every pair sold, another was donated to someone in need. Customers didn't just buy shoes, they bought into a cause. That emotional connection drove word of mouth, loyalty, and global growth. Simon realized that starting with why didn't mean ignoring the what or the how. It meant putting them in service to something bigger. The what and how were tools, the why was the compass. And when the compass was clear, the tools could be used with focus and impact. He once worked with a hospital that wanted to improve patient satisfaction. Most ideas focused on faster check-ins, cleaner rooms, or better food. But Simon asked, "Why do you exist?" The staff paused. Then a nurse said quietly, "To bring comfort and hope to people in their most vulnerable moments." That became the lens through which every change was made. Suddenly, it wasn't about amenities. It was about dignity, about being present, about empathy. Patient scores rose, but more importantly, the staff felt reconnected to their mission. It was easy to forget the why in the chaos of operations, in meetings, deadlines, quotas. But that was precisely when it mattered most. Because in the absence of purpose, people defaulted to rules, fear, and self-preservation. But with purpose, they collaborated, took risks, and gave their best. Simon also noticed that starting with why didn't just help externally, it built internal resilience. Organizations with a strong why weathered storms better. They had loyal employees who stuck around during downturns. They had customers who forgave mistakes. They had partners who stayed invested. Purpose acted like glue. It held people together when everything else was shaking. There was a startup Simon worked with during a funding crisis. Investors pulled out, sales dipped, morale plummeted. But the founders rallied the team, not with projections, but with passion. They reminded everyone of why they had started, to give artisans in remote villages access to global markets. That story reignited the team. They cut costs, hustled for orders, and leaned on their community. Eventually, they found new investors who shared their belief. They survived, not because of cash flow, but because of clarity. Simon often warned that clarity of why required discipline. It wasn't a one-time statement. It was a daily practice. It had to show up in hiring, in culture, in customer service. It had to be modeled by leaders, not just preached. And it had to evolve without losing its essence. He saw this clearly in the case of Disney. Walt Disney's original why was to create happiness through magical experiences. That belief shaped everything from theme parks to animation. After his death, the company faced challenges, but each time they returned to that purpose, they found their way. Whether launching a new film or expanding a resort, the question remained, does this make people feel wonder? Does it create joy? Starting with why wasn't about slogans or mission statements. It was about alignment. Alignment between belief and behavior, between message and experience. When that alignment was strong, trust followed, and trust was the foundation of influence. Simon believed that influence wasn't about persuasion, it was about inspiration. You didn't push people toward action. You drew them in with belief. You lit a fire in them, not under them. That was true leadership. In school systems, he saw principals who led with data and others who led with dreams. The former improved scores, the latter changed lives. In nonprofits, he saw directors who chased grants and others who built movements. The difference wasn't resources, it was purpose. The more he spoke, the more he wrote, the more stories Simon collected, each one a testament to the power of why. A coffee shop in Seattle that created jobs for homeless youth, a software firm in India that taught coding to underprivileged kids, a construction company in Canada that used profits to fund mental health initiatives. None of them were the biggest, but they were beloved, because they believed in something more than profit, and people sensed it. Humans are wired to seek meaning. We gravitate toward clarity. We want to know that what we do matters, that who we are fits into something larger, that we belong. Simon's message was simple, but profound. If you want to inspire, if you want to lead, if you want to create something lasting, start with why. Across industries, geographies, and generations, the pattern held firm. The individuals and organizations that inspired the deepest loyalty, that drove the strongest followings, were always those who started with why. They didn't begin by telling people what they made or how they made it. They spoke from belief. They led with cause. And in doing so, they didn't just sell products, they built movements. Simon remembered visiting a small town where a local grocery store had become the beating heart of the community. On the surface, it looked no different from any other shop. But inside, the atmosphere told a different story. Staff remembered customers' names. They stocked shelves based on requests, not just supply contracts. They held events for local schools and farmers. Their why was simple: nourish the community. That purpose flowed through every interaction. Customers didn't just shop there. They felt seen, valued, remembered. And when a national chain opened just down the road, offering lower prices and more variety, most of the town stayed loyal. Because price was just one part of the equation. The emotional connection mattered more. Simon saw this emotional connection as the deepest form of influence. Not manipulation, not persuasion, but inspiration. The difference lay in intent. Manipulation was about getting someone to do something for your benefit. Inspiration was about sharing beliefs so powerfully that others willingly joined your cause. He often contrasted two common strategies: discounting versus belief. A company could offer 20% off and get a spike in sales. But the moment the discount ended, the customers vanished. Another company could speak clearly about its mission: to protect the planet, to celebrate artisans, to empower wellness, and see slower but steadier growth. Their customers stayed, referred friends, shared their stories. Because belief, once sparked, became self-sustaining. Simon called this the trust dividend. When people trust you, everything becomes easier. Hiring, retention, word of mouth, crisis management. And trust didn't come from perfect operations. It came from consistency, from living the why, not just stating it. There was a CEO Simon met named Jeremy. His company made eco-friendly packaging. Their mission was to eliminate plastic waste. But one year, they had to temporarily use a less sustainable material due to supply chain issues. Jeremy didn't hide it. He told their customers, partners, and staff exactly what had happened and why. He shared the steps they were taking to fix it. And because the company had built trust through years of consistent purpose, people understood. They stayed. They supported the company even through a mistake, because they believed in the intention. The lesson was clear. People will forgive what you do, but they won't forgive why you did it. If your motives are trusted, your errors are human. If your motives are questioned, even your successes feel suspicious. Simon often emphasized that starting with why required courage. It meant being willing to say no to tempting shortcuts. It meant being vulnerable, sharing beliefs, not just facts. And it meant holding a long-term view in a world obsessed with quarterly results. He admired leaders who stayed grounded in purpose even when pressures mounted. Leaders like Herb Kelleher of Southwest Airlines, who once turned down lucrative business class upgrades because they didn't align with the company's mission to keep air travel affordable, or Howard Schultz of Starbucks, who closed all stores for retraining because the customer experience had drifted too far from their original purpose. In both cases, competitors scoffed, analysts questioned, but those decisions rooted in why ultimately strengthened the brand, because they signaled consistency, integrity, a willingness to walk the talk. Simon knew that clarity of why created alignment, and alignment created speed. When everyone in an organization understood the why, decisions could be made faster. Less time was spent convincing, debating, second-guessing. Teams moved in unison, guided by a shared belief. He once helped a fast-growing startup facing chaos. As they hired quickly, departments began clashing. Priorities were misaligned. Morale dropped. Instead of new rules or org charts, Simon led a process to clarify their why. They landed on this: to build tools that gave small businesses a voice. Once that was articulated, it became a filter. Should they pursue that partnership? Only if it amplified small businesses. Should they build that feature? Only if it empowered users, not vendors. Within weeks, friction eased. People felt connected again. That clarity also helped in recruiting. Job seekers didn't just see a job description, they saw a cause. And those who shared the belief showed up ready to contribute. Others self-selected out, which was good, because culture isn't built by who you attract, it's shaped by who stays. Simon reminded leaders that starting with why wasn't a marketing gimmick. It wasn't something to be laminated and framed. It had to live in meetings, in hiring, in strategy. It had to guide actions, not just slogans. He once visited a nonprofit that had an impressive mission statement: to empower youth through education. But when he asked staff why they worked there, the answers varied wildly. Some said stability, others mentioned perks, a few shrugged. The mission hadn't been internalized. It was words on a wall, not a lived belief. Together, they began a process of rediscovery. Staff shared stories of moments that moved them. A volunteer recalled seeing a child speak confidently for the first time. A teacher remembered a student who said, "I never thought I was smart until now." Those stories became the why, not vague empowerment, but igniting confidence. Once that belief was shared, everything aligned. Programs changed, messaging changed, energy returned. Simon believed that purpose couldn't be manufactured. It had to be discovered. And that discovery required listening, not just to founders or executives, but to the people who carried the organization forward. The ones on the front lines, in the trenches. Their stories held clues to the real why. In his travels, Simon collected hundreds of such stories. A bakery that employed former inmates, a toy company that donated one toy for everyone sold, a transportation firm that created career paths for veterans. Each story was different, but the pattern was the same: belief before behavior, cause before commerce. He remembered a restaurant in Austin, run by a chef who said his mission was to serve love on a plate. That sounded poetic, but Simon saw the truth of it in how the servers greeted guests, how dishes were prepared with care, how staff were treated with dignity. The restaurant wasn't the cheapest or the fanciest, but it was always full. People felt something there. That was the power of why. It created emotion. Emotion fueled memory, and memory shaped loyalty. Simon noted that many leaders struggled to articulate their why, not because they didn't have one, but because they were afraid to say it aloud, afraid it might sound soft, or naive, or unmeasurable. But he challenged them. What's more powerful than belief? What's more sustainable than purpose? The organizations that ignored this truth often paid the price. They became reactive, tactical, chasing trends instead of setting them. Their messages felt hollow. Their teams burned out. And when challenges came, they crumbled. Simon often said, "If you don't know why you do what you do, how will anyone else?" That question haunted many, but it also liberated them. Because once the why was clear, it was like flipping a light on. Confusion faded, momentum built. He also addressed the myth that the why had to be world-changing. It didn't have to be about curing disease or ending poverty. It just had to be true, authentic. For some, it was giving families peace of mind. For others, it was making people smile. What mattered wasn't the scale of the cause, but the sincerity of it. He remembered a locksmith who said, "I help people feel safe." That belief guided how he priced, how he communicated, even how he trained apprentices. And customers felt it. They trusted him not just to fix locks, but to protect homes. Simon emphasized that starting with why wasn't the end. It was the beginning. A strong why needed a disciplined how and a clear what. Purpose without execution was just a dream. Execution without purpose was just a task. The magic came when belief and behavior aligned. In Apple's case, the why was to challenge the status quo. The how was sleek design, user-friendly interfaces, and integrated systems. The what was computers, phones, and devices. But it all started with why. And that's why people lined up overnight, not for the product, but for what it represented. Simon helped companies map their golden circles. The center, why. The next ring, how. The outer ring, what. Most started from the outside in, but the ones who led, inspired, lasted, they moved from the inside out. He knew that this framework wasn't a formula. It was a lens, a way to see the world, a way to lead. And once seen, it couldn't be unseen. As he looked around the world, at brands rising and falling, at leaders connecting or flailing, Simon returned to one truth. People want to follow those who believe what they believe. They want to feel something real. And that reality begins when someone dares to start with why. The idea had now taken hold in places far beyond the boardroom or the conference stage. Teachers were using it to reframe their classrooms. Coaches were using it to energize their teams. Artists, doctors, designers, all re-examining their purpose, all seeking the clarity of why. Because once understood, the question doesn't go away. It lives in every decision, in every message, in every action. Simon had seen its ripple effect in real time. He watched as a school district inspired by the Start With Why philosophy gathered all its principals for a retreat. They didn't discuss curriculum or discipline policies. Instead, they asked, "Why do we educate?" It wasn't an easy conversation. Some focused on college readiness. Others spoke of life skills. But beneath all the answers was a shared belief. that every child deserves to be seen, challenged, and inspired. That belief became the foundation for change. The schools didn't get more funding. They didn't replace all the teachers. But test scores improved. Student engagement rose, and community trust returned. Not because of what they taught, but because of why they taught. Simon understood now more than ever that a clear why gave people a reason to care, to show up early, to stay late, to push through obstacles. When people believed in the purpose behind their work, they didn't need pep talks. They became self-fueled. One of the most moving moments in Simon's journey came when he visited a small rural hospital. The staff was under-resourced, overwhelmed, and operating on razor-thin margins. But morale was high, turnover was low, and patients spoke of compassion and care unlike anything they'd experienced in big city clinics. When Simon asked the director how they sustained such a culture, the answer was simple. We believe every person deserves to be treated like someone's mother. That was their why. It wasn't posted in corporate language on the wall. It lived in the way nurses held hands, in how doctors explained procedures gently, in how janitors took time to ask patients if they needed anything. The belief transcended the job description. It wasn't taught, it was lived. That level of belief transformed organizations from the inside out. When leadership hired for alignment with why, culture grew strong. When onboarding reinforced why, retention rose. When managers praised based on why, motivation deepened. Simon once met a retail company that had adopted the Start With Why approach in full. Their why was to bring joy to everyday moments. They weren't selling clothes. They were selling confidence, delight, self-expression. Staff meetings started with stories about customers who'd felt transformed by a small purchase. Inventory was chosen not just for margins, but for meaning. And even during tough quarters, the team rallied, not for bonuses, but because they believed. He remembered speaking with a store manager who said, "I used to feel like I was in sales. Now I feel like I'm in service." That shift was everything, because service is rooted in belief. Sales is rooted in tactics. Simon had seen what happened when that belief disappeared. He'd walked through offices where no one smiled, where leaders talked metrics but never meaning, where values were printed on mouse pads but never practiced. And over time, those companies faded. Talent left. Customers drifted. Innovation dried up. Not because they lacked capability, but because they lacked conviction. Purpose was fuel. And without it, even the most talented teams stalled. Simon also emphasized that the why wasn't just a message, it was a responsibility. Once you declared your belief, the world expected you to live it. That accountability scared some leaders, but Simon saw it as a gift, a constant reminder to stay honest, to stay aligned, to stay true. He often told the story of a hotel chain that had publicly declared its purpose as hospitality from the heart. Guests saw the commercials, staff wore pins with the phrase, but the reality didn't match. Service felt rushed. Rooms were clean but cold. Feedback was ignored. And over time, the gap between message and experience eroded trust. Simon worked with their leadership to narrow that gap, not through rebranding, but through re-believing. They revisited the origins of the company, the founder's story, the first guests served. They unearthed what hospitality from the heart really meant. Then they began retraining, not in scripts, but in empathy, not in checklists, but in connection. Slowly, the culture began to shift, not because of slogans, but because of sincerity. Simon had come to see the role of a leader not as the smartest person in the room, but as the one who held the why, who protected it, who reminded everyone what they were building and why it mattered. That kind of leadership was rare, but when it appeared, it changed everything. He recalled a time when a struggling nonprofit was on the verge of closing. The team was exhausted, donors were fading, programs were shrinking. But the director, instead of presenting a survival plan, gathered her team and told the story of a single family they had helped. She read a letter from a teenager who said, "Because of you, I believe I have a future." There was silence. Then tears. Then a renewed sense of urgency, not out of fear, but out of belief. Staff volunteered weekends. Donors stepped up. Partners came forward. The organization survived. Not because of a pivot, but because of a purpose. Simon learned that belief is contagious, but so is doubt. Leaders who believed in their why inspired teams who believed in themselves. Leaders who wavered created confusion. That's why clarity mattered so much, why alignment mattered so much. He had once consulted with a global brand that was seeking reinvention. For decades, they'd been known for quality, but newer competitors had emerged. Innovation had slowed, culture had fractured. Simon asked the CEO why he had joined the company decades earlier. The man paused, then said, "Because I believed we made things that lasted." That was the spark. That belief in durability, in timeless value, became the new foundation. Not innovation for innovation's sake, but innovation that honored legacy. The messaging changed, the product lines refocused. Internally, people remembered what made them proud. The company didn't just recover, it evolved. Simon saw that evolution wasn't about abandoning the past. It was about returning to the essence of why and expressing it in new ways. Even in his own life, Simon felt the weight of his message. He asked himself every day, why am I doing this? Why write? Why speak? Why build? And the answer never changed. He believed in a world where people felt inspired at work, safe among colleagues, and fulfilled by what they did. That was his why. Everything else, books, talks, interviews, was just the what. He reminded people that their why didn't have to be loud, or polished, or poetic. It just had to be real. Some found their why in faith, others in family, some in service, others in creativity. But everyone had one. The key was to listen for it, to pay attention to the moments that moved you, to the stories you told over and over, to the work that didn't feel like work. That's where the why lived. He urged people to write their why in a single sentence. Not for the resume, not for the website, but for themselves. Something simple, something true, and to test it. Do others see it in you? Do you feel it in your best moments? Does it guide you in hard ones? Simon knew the work was never done. That clarity faded. The distractions crept in. That pressure pulled people away from purpose. But he also knew that returning to the why was always possible. It was a choice, a practice, a discipline. He watched companies transform when they remembered. He watched individuals come alive when they reconnected. He watched teams become tribes, customers become evangelists, brands become beliefs. And so he continued, speaking, writing, listening. Not because of ambition, but because of belief. That was his why. In the end, the message was not about business, or branding, or leadership theory. It was about humanity, about the part of us that longs for meaning, that seeks belonging, that yearns to matter. Because when we start with why, we start with who we are. Thank you for joining us on this deep and transformative journey. In a world racing forward at lightning speed, the only true advantage is the ability to adapt, to grow, and to learn continuously. We hope this audiobook inspired you to challenge your comfort zone, embrace reflection, and become a lifelong learner. If this resonated with you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Victory Think, your destination for powerful book insights, one story at a time. Stay curious, keep evolving, and see you in the next story.